Okay, so we'll kind of continue where we left off, talking about how some of the things that we went over for professional sports will be a little bit different for at the collegiate level. So we left off on, let's see where we at. I believe we were looking at cartels. So I kind of had this rough drawing here, but I'm kind of going to go over this a little bit in more detail. So go to the dot cam, kind of starting out, get a little bit more graphs in here today than we did last class. Oh. Oh. There it goes. All right. So we're thinking about, how a cartel operates. We generally think about it's controlling the product, right? So, here our product was really going to be kind of the number of games, right? So we said each team's going to have their own supply curve. So we could think of maybe I have something like this, where I've got team A and team B. So what the NCAA does is it looks at this and says, okay, and like I said, they've got way more teams. We're going to start out with 2 to make it a little bit easier. But they say, okay, any number of games here, there's only this one team willing to supply any games. So once we hit this number of games here, our marginal cost curve would really be the sum of these two, okay? Now, if I've got the overall demand curve, so here it's kind of our demand for the number of collegiate games, whether or not we're looking at football or basketball. And here's kind of that marginal cost curve that the cartel knows exists because it just adds up the marginal cost curves, really. Remember, supply represents our marginal costs to get our aggregate marginal cost curve. So if this is a perfectly competitive market, our aggregate marginal cost curve really represents kind of supply from the entire league. And where supply is equal to demand, we'd be at a quantity of games. We'll call this Q1 out here. Or actually, let's call this QPC, so quantity of the perfectly competitive in a perfectly competitive market. However, when they act as a cartel, right, they're trying to organize the decisions of everybody involved, every team involved, so that they can act like a monopolist and set quantity based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Okay? Now, how would a monopolist set quantity? Well, that's just going to be wherever marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue, right? Nothing really changes there from a typical monopoly. And you can see that the number of games we get, because the NCAA is acting as a cartel, is going to be quite a bit fewer than if we allow this to be a perfectly competitive market. Right? And that's not wildly, this isn't a wild assumption that they have monopoly power because there's no other collegiate football organization competing with them. Maybe you could argue the crossover with them in the NFL, maybe they lose a little bit of that monopoly power and it gets closer to perfectly competitive. And I'm not going to bring this model into this class, but if we really wanted to try to perfectly model kind of what the NCAA faces and the NFL when those seasons cross over, it probably looks more like a monopolistically competitive market, which will change things a little bit, but it'd be the same general ideas here, right? They're still going to set the quantity of games lower than what a perfectly competitive market would be. Okay? Any questions here? Probably could have, might have helped if I would have said, drawn this in a different color where this aggregate marginal cost curve, right, kind of runs out here. Okay. We're okay with that? All right. Make sure there's nothing in the chat here. Okay. So with that in mind, we also kind of briefly discussed that usually now whenever we have monopoly power, we're also going to have monopsony power, right? If I'm the only one who can hire a collegiate football player, that kind of sounds weird to say that, but if they're the only organization that can hire a collegiate football player, they're the only person, the only consumer, the only person demanding labor in this area. So we see the NCAA has monopsony power. They greatly restrict player movement. They've kind of been making decisions more recently that allows players to kind of leave their colleges to different teams a little bit easier. But it's kind of like that reserve clause, right? We said once a player was on a team, when we had the reserve clause in Major League Baseball, they were the only team that could actually sign a deal with that player. So what did that do? Gave them monopsony power, right? I kind of already mentioned this. So, this is also kind of going away, but you can also think other ways they restrict it is whenever they make it so that a player has to spend a certain amount of years kind of after high school to then declare and enter a draft in specific leagues. And, certain leagues have added this and taken it away, like the NBA, or you have college football where they still require a certain number of years. So they're restricting player movement, okay? So with this monopsony power, what's going to happen? Well, what did we say happens before? If I've got monopsony power, what happens to player wages? Player wages will be higher, lower, stay the same. Nobody wants to take a guess? All right. Let's go back to the model then. Right. So if we had monopsony power, right, we'll want to review this. I think we actually had some of this on the first exam, but anytime we have monopsony power, so we're thinking about the labor market here, and here it becomes a little bit weird. So usually we're thinking about these as wages, right? But we talked about last class, at the collegiate level, there's really no wages that can be increased, right? That's illegal. Unless we resort to a black market, we can't see an increase truly in wages. But we can see an increase in other things that would provide players utility. So you almost want to think about here, usually when we think about wages, this is really going to be like the utility that those schools are going to be providing to that NCAA player. Right? So we've got our supply curve of labor, our demand curve of labor, right? We said with monopsony power, it's kind of the opposite of monopoly power, where they make decisions based off of a marginal expenditure curve that's twice as steep as supply. We've done this already in the past. Now they make a decision, unlike the monopoly, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They're going to set it where their marginal expenditure is equal to that demand curve or equal to their marginal benefit. Right? That's another, we said that's what the demand curve reflects. So they set the quantity here, but they know that players would be willing to provide this much labor, right? Or the last player that supplies their labor would be willing to do so, right, at a much lower wage. So we'll call this the monopsony wage, much lower than that perfectly competitive wage, right? And the perfectly competitive wage is just where supply is equal to demand, right? Kind of our traditional way of finding the equilibrium. Okay? So even though it's not in wages, you can almost think about it as, if I have monopsony power, maybe I don't have to invest as much into my facilities, right, to attract players. Okay? Now, there may be monopsony power from the NCAA, right, in terms of kind of how many players are going to end up playing collegiate football or collegiate basketball or whatever sport we're looking at. But then, between teams, we talked about last class, we know that there's a lot of competition, right? That any one team probably doesn't have this monopsony power, at least when it's trying to attract players there. Once they're there, maybe it could offer them lower, fewer amenities, maybe not be as lenient with their grades or something like that. But in terms of when they're attracting that player, we probably don't have monopsony power. We're only thinking about monopsony power existing once they choose the team that they enroll in, because then they can't leave, or at least there's barriers to them leaving. Okay. Any questions over this? Or, all right with that? Okay. So I promised a few more graphs today, so we've already gotten a few. So we got lower wages and potentially fewer players that are playing that specific sport, right? Because the monopsony power kind of exists at that NCAA level as opposed to at the team level. All right, so we're going to transition a little bit into something that I don't have the perfect memory. So a little bit of this is we're going to kind of be going through it together. This is basically what the NCAA has set up in terms of their academic standards. Right? And we'll then kind of look at what they have set up and think about the economic implications of that. So, it's good to have these academic standards. If we're thinking about overall, like, you don't want just to accept any student athlete into the program if they're going to be getting, a 1.2 GPA, right? So if anyone has a 1.2 GPA, I didn't mean to offend you there. So, but, we want a higher quality of students. So it's a pro. The con is it's just another barrier to entry. If we were purely basing this off of the value of the marginal product of labor of these players, right? If that's purely what we were basing this off of, we wouldn't care about their academic quality. All we would care about is their athletic quality, similar to a professional league, right? I mean, they care about your intellectual ability to the extent that you can play the position that they're hiring to play. But in terms of your book smart here, if we're truly just going off of the value of their marginal product, we wouldn't build that in, right? So another barrier to entry, a little bit more kind of this monopsony power, right? So some of the qualifications that you would need for an athletic scholarship, right? We've got this sliding scale of, you have to have a certain GPA, although this is kind of going by the wayside in more recent years. Even here at Ball State, they've, incoming freshmen don't have to send or kind of their SAT or ACT scores. So, but, they still look at your high school GPA, right? So if it's low enough, right, if you see a high school student with a 1.0 GPA, if I'm a big athletic program, I'm probably concerned about taking that student because I'm kind of taking a risk. Because I know that the NCAA has certain academic standards that need to be met. And so if they don't meet that, well, then the quality of that player essentially goes to zero. The value of their marginal product would be zero if they can't play because they're academically ineligible. Right? They also require, certain core courses from high school. This is something like too crazy. What they then do is for each sport, right, they have this measure of the academic progress rate. So they realize that some students may come in not as high of academic quality, but that they at least want to see the progression being kind of going in the right way, right? So they'll do it for each individual sport, and then they also calculate this at the athletic department level. So every single sport is kind of grouped into one at that university. So this APR, right, the way it's calculated, it's basically the NCAA is going to set a threshold and say, if you're not above this, your sports program is going to get sanctions, or eventually we potentially eliminate that program. We'll go kind of the specific details of exactly what those limits are here. So how do we actually compute every single sports and every single university's APR, right, or academic progress rate? So each school gets 1 point if athletes just stay enrolled at the university. So why do you think that maybe we're getting points for simply having that person stay enrolled? I've got professional leagues, let's say, think about maybe in terms of basketball and football. A lot of times you'll see these students leave early, right? They'll only play a couple years, or maybe even, in basketball, we see a lot of times they'll only play 1 year, right? So what this is trying to do is it's trying to reward schools that are trying to get student athletes that they're also trying to graduate, right? That they're not just going out and getting a player because the value of the marginal wins they had is high, right? They're going out and getting, because the value of their marginal wins is high, but also to ensure they get a college degree. Right? This is the NCAA's kind of goal by making this part of this APR metric. Okay? They also receive a point if the athlete stays academically eligible, right? So for every single person on the team that stays academically eligible year to year, the school receives an additional point. Right? This one's kind of self-explanatory, right? They just want to make sure that they're maintaining some level of grade GPA that's adequate, right? And I say adequate here. This is set pretty low, so and then once you add up all those points, right? So every player that stays enrolled, your team gets a point. Every single player that remains eligible, your team receives a point. So you add all those up, divide by the total points possible, right? And this varies sport to sport because the number of players on the football team is different than the basketball team, but you're really just getting the ratio of how many of the possible points in my sport did I earn? You're then going to multiply that by 100, so that it kind of looks more, it's not in decimal form and you see a bunch of decimals. It gives us a nice kind of integer to look at as well. So the requirement is 930. So basically, if we take away the 100 here, you're getting 93% of the possible points. So it's not, it seems relatively high, but I mean, for a lot of these points, it's just a matter of if you can keep the kids enrolled, right? I shouldn't say kids, for keeping these student athletes, right, enrolled. So if you don't meet this APR requirement, if your team falls below 930, right, then you're going to first receive a reprimand, like the NCAA was going to put out there, hey, these programs failed, right, a little public shaming, right? So there's an incentive not to look bad in the terms of society or kind of a social setting. But then the next time that you fail to meet the requirement, you start losing scholarships, right? Or I think the other one was what? Yeah, they take away practice time or the amount of time that the coach can be with the athletes. Rich, what's number 2 really going to do? What's going to be the impact of that? The team's quality would go down, right? So if our team quality goes down, right, this is a pretty big incentive for the teams then not to fall under this 930, at least not twice in a row. Maybe they don't care about the public reprimand, but they care a lot more about losing the quality in their program. And then if they, I guess, kind of want to continue to go about recruiting the wrong type of student athletes, they actually can become banned from postseason play. Right? So this might not seem like, actually, we think about, if any of you follow kind of our college basketball, college football, I don't even know the last time I saw it in like a big media publication, even somebody getting publicly reprimanded. I can't recall one, at least since I've been following, but it's probably going to be a different set of teams than would make that national media. Okay. So, oh, sorry, I forgot. There's a 4th one. You lose membership. I don't think anyone's ever kind of gotten to that level. Maybe. I don't know, I think I might have it in another slide. Maybe there was one school in a specific sport that ended up getting booted. So let's just look at what some of these APRs look like across different sports. Right? And this starts to bring up a kind of interesting issue. So if we look at here, we've got men's sports, and here we've got women's sports, and it's broken down by, what do we got? Ice hockey, we've got bowling down here. Notice that for women's sports, I mean, none of them are even remotely kind of on average close to that 930. They're all well above, right? And every one of these programs has a strong incentive to keep, above that 930. So at least these incentives look like they're doing their job. However, if we start looking at kind of the football, right, which based off what we looked at last class, we said that the football programs, those are where we saw the largest revenues, right? These big NCAA college football programs, that's where the largest revenue is being made. And so if there's a lot of revenue being made, maybe the schools are a little bit more lax in who they're accepting, right? Because they know if I can get, right? Hold on. So I'm going to draw something along with this discussion because I think it'll help. So remember, that demand curve for labor, or the value of that marginal wins per labor, is really reflecting the marginal revenue per win that player is bringing in times the marginal number of wins from that labor. Right? So when I look at really large programs, they're like, look, if I can get a really high quality player, this is going to be a huge value to my school. Well, they're high quality, but we're not sure they're going to be able to kind of meet the academic standards. If I look at their GPA, it wouldn't be a high school GPA we would usually let into the university. Right? But when that player is going to bring in my university a ton of revenue, maybe I take a second look, even though their GPA is below what I usually would accept, right? And I know that I can provide them with tutors, and I know that they're going to have kind of the coach on them. So they're going to be a little bit more lax with the academic standards if they know that player is going to bring in a high amount of additional revenue. What players are bringing in a high amount of additional revenue? Players of really high quality, right? Add a huge number of additional wins to that team. Okay. So in the sports where the marginal revenue per win is the highest, kind of men's football here, we see, yep, they're a little bit more lax, right? The average kind of APR, they have the lowest one. Now, if we look at FCS schools, so these are going to be kind of some smaller division schools, right? Actually, wait, am I saying this right? FBS. Yeah, so the FCS is going to be like your D2. I don't know, I'm from Michigan, but like the Grand Valley States and kind of these smaller, somewhat smaller universities. Well, what we end up seeing is they end up being a little bit more lax as well, because they know that if they can bring in this high quality player, the only way they can compete with larger D1 programs is if that student may not be academically eligible at those, or those schools don't want to take a chance on that. Right? Think about it this way. If I have two high quality players coming out of high school, and by all metrics, they're the same exact quality, right? If I am a major university, let's say University of Alabama, they pretty much have their pick. So they've got these two really high quality, they think they're going to have the same level of success at the collegiate level, but one of them has a 2.0 GPA and one of them has a 3.5. Which one do you think they're going to take? Well, if I can get the same quality player and not have to worry about failing this APR, and having them not be eligible, I'm always going to choose the player that has the higher academics as well, all else equal, right? Holding constant quality. These kind of D2 programs in smaller football, they don't have that luxury. If they want to attract a high quality player, they can't compete with Alabama, right? They can't provide the same facilities. They can't provide the same probability of making it to professional level. So what can they maybe compete on? Maybe lowering the academic standards a little bit, right? In terms of who they're going to accept, okay? And sure enough, their team APR on average is quite, the lowest. Okay? Any questions on that for you? We kind of keep moving. It's not kind of really a graph we can kind of draw to explain this. This is more of a kind of economic intuition and economic principles where we have to talk through. But if we look at this, on average, all of them are above that 930. But right, these are the averages. So maybe there's some football programs that are, have APRs of 999, and maybe there's some others that are falling below that 930. Right? There's going to be a distribution of these APR metric. So we already said if they fail to meet this APR, we might see a postseason ban occur if they can fail it 3 times in a row. I think I have some actual ones that did. So there's a website, and actually here we go. So if you want to kind of play around this yourself, you can copy paste the little kind of hyperlink down there, and you can basically sort through different types of sports, different different universities, and see when they've ever been kind of penalized for not making that APR, or not hitting that 930. So schools that got postseason bans, so this was what we went, if we go back, that was when we had, 3 failures in a row, so 3 consecutive years of failures. So Alcorn State and Savannah State in basketball got a ban. And then Florida A&M, Howard, Morgan State, Savannah State again, and then Southern, I think it's a University of the Southern, or I forget exactly what that is. Is that what it is? University of the Southern, or Southern University, something like that. But they kind of show up in the data as just Southern. Excuse me. They all got a ban in football. So we've got several programs. But if we look at these team names, if we have any familiarity with college sports, we don't see teams that we usually even see in the tournament or in these bowl games, right? And why is that? Well, because what did we say in the previous slide is true at these D2 schools? Well, the only way they can compete is by lowering academic standards or taking on high quality but academically risky players. Well, that's the same thing going on here. These are D1 programs. They could be D1 programs. It's just that the only way that, Morgan State can compete with, I think Morgan State's in West Virginia, so the only way they compete with West Virginia University for the same quality player is to be a little bit more lax on the academic standards, high school GPA, when they're looking at kind of accepting that player into their program. Okay? So this is pretty strong evidence of that. Prior to 2012, actually, sorry, this would have been the 2012, 2013. So I guess it depends on what sport you're talking about. But the requirement used to be a lot lower, right? So it used to be set at 900. And, prior to that, only 18 schools that kind of lost access to the postseason prior to, so we had a much longer time frame here, and only 18 failed. Here, I think this data I grabbed was actually only up to 2018 because it doesn't have the most recent years on that website that I had posted. So, we see a lot more schools failing over, not even a 7-year time frame. We already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 schools failing. Well, as the entire time prior to 2012 and 2013, we kind of only had 18 there, right? 18 have postseason bans. if we would have went back and we applied the new standard, that would have risen from 18 to 42. So if we go back and like retroactively set the APR at 930 instead of 900 for those earlier years, we've had a lot more schools failing, right? I didn't play around with the data set enough. It would be very interesting to like look at those teams that just barely make the cutoff, right? And if teams that were just barely making the cutoff before, well, maybe they wouldn't become academically ineligible. They just would have taken actions to barely meet the cutoff after it rose to 930, right? That would be like an interesting paper kind of project to kind of look at playing around with this data set. Okay. So we've got these academic standards. I think I've already kind of mentioned this. I got a little bit ahead of myself. But you know, schools that have more resources, the higher quality programs are always going to be able to attract the higher quality athletes. Because they're attracting all the high quality athletes, they can then be a little bit pickier with choosing the highest academic athletes as well, right? Holding the quality constant, making sure that they're also getting an academically adequate student athlete. So if we think about major programs, we would expect to see University of Indiana, Notre Dame, we would expect to see all of them probably not falling below that 930, right? Not falling below that poor academic kind of measure. Smaller schools are going to be the ones that it's going to be a little bit harder for them, right? Because the only way they can attract or compete or be attracted to these college athletes is to be a little bit more lax on the academic standards. So they should be the ones that we are more likely to seek at these postseason bans or have their scholarships restricted. So what impact is this going to have on competitive balance? So let's think about what happens if I take away scholarships, or even if I get a high quality player, but they become ineligible, right? They were of lower academic kind of standards or academic quality. What programs is this going to hurt, and what programs will this help? I kind of already mentioned, right? Your schools like University of Indiana, Notre Dame, maybe they can be a little bit pickier with who they accept, even holding quality constant. So they're less likely to fail this APR standard. Okay? They're less likely to fail that, then they're going to be able to kind of keep all of their keep all of their scholarships. Whereas these smaller programs who are kind of taking chances on these lower academic quality students are going to be more likely to have their scholarships restricted, which we said earlier is going to reduce their quality. So competitive balance is going to be kind of worsened by the use of this academic standard, this APR kind of 930 threshold. Now, okay, it hurts competitive balance. I'm sure the, and then there have been studies that have been done, some of these peer-reviewed papers that we've looked at that do find this, right? This theoretical prediction is in fact proven by the data. Well, from the NCAA, we know that we don't want competitive balance to get worse, because what does that do? Well, that decreases our demand curve, decreases our marginal revenue curve. And so we don't want that, right? We want better competitive balance, but, right, I also have to have some kind of academic requirement, right? If I just kind of let this be the wild, wild west, maybe that's actually going to dilute my product to where people will then kind of, look at collegiate sports as, well, they really, they're not even trying to kind of have these be student athletes. They're just wanting them to be athletes. So I'm guessing, if I had to, sneak into the NCAA meetings, I'm guessing that's why they even increased from 900 to that 930 APR, right? Because even though that might decrease competitive balance a little bit, and I might lose a little revenue there, it at least makes it look better. I don't have students or programs becoming ineligible every year, couple years. I don't have postseason bans. I said that backwards. So even though the competitive balance gets worse, right, at least I don't have as many media publications about, oh yeah, but look at the academic progress rating and how low it is and how poor performing some of these schools are. And so if, a lot of that gets out there, maybe that detracts from my demand curve as well. So it's kind of a trade-off between those two things that the NCAA is trying to balance when they're setting that APR threshold. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so Yes, so the schools that decide to lower their academic standards, that would help improve competitive balance, right? But the threshold being set is then going to make it more likely that those smaller programs get scholarship restrictions, postseason bans, and not only that, that the player becomes ineligible. Well, if the player is ineligible, he doesn't add anything. He doesn't increase quality on the team at all. So you're right. Like, it starts out, you would think, okay, well, if they can compete by lowering their standards, maybe that helps improve competitive balance, but only if we don't have a threshold set, right? Once we set that threshold, exactly. Yep. Any other questions at this point? Oh, we got one coming in here. Oh, we're decreasing. Yep. So we have a decrease in competitive balance here. Sorry, I missed your comment in real time there, but yeah. Okay. So if we're okay on that, that's kind of our academic standards. I said last class, we're going to start diving really deep into this labor market and think about the problems, or maybe a method in which we could pay players. Okay. So this is something that, even as recent as a couple years ago, I know they're talking, collegiate football players have talked about unionizing, or have talked about, what would it look like if we transition to allow schools to pay players. So we think about what's the value, right, of these NCAA Division I and FCS football players, right? Well, if we try to get a number on it, right, the average revenue, kind of coming from a football program, is $31.9 million. Right? That's the average across all of these football programs, or collegiate football programs. If we then simply took the total number of football players that we see on scholarship at these big kind of universities, so 85, we look at the roster, 85, divide the average revenue by the number of players. Right? So that's what we're going to do next. Right? Well, we can't give all of that, because if we're trying to mimic the professional leagues, we even discussed there are limits set there. The limit the NFL sets is we need at least 48% of all revenue being given to player salary. So let's say the NCAA looks at NCAA football looks at the NFL and says, okay, we'll do exactly what they're doing. Whatever revenue your program is generating, 48% of it has to go to player salaries. Okay, so we'll take kind of that average revenue now, multiply it by 0.48, or 48% of it, and then divide it by 85, and we will get that each player could be given about $180,000. Now, this is the average. So what does that mean about some schools like the University of Alabama or the University of Texas? How much would each of their players be getting? A much higher amount. But what about Indiana State? They're should be a lot. We can't require Indiana State to give their players $180,000, right? There's no way they can meet that. So this is just the average, but it gives us an idea about, man, this is like where these salaries would actually be, like pretty high. I can tell you right now, the value of a scholarship, probably a lot of these schools doesn't quite get up that high. Right? Okay, we can do the same thing for basketball. The numbers are just a little bit different. Kind of notice there, because we have fewer players on the team, it actually ends up being that even though they make less revenue in basketball on average, right, 5 versus 31 million, there's a lot fewer players to divide that up. So this gives us an idea, but we already said we know that this won't work, right? Because the smaller programs can't pay like this. If we set the minimum wage at $195,000 here, there's no way they can do that. Okay? So that's not going to work, but at least gives us a starting point. So should colleges be able to discriminate against the type of sport, right? Because we just broke down basketball and football. Well, what if I'm trying to set a universal wage for student athletes? Well, I mean, if I try to do that here, and let's say I'm generous. Maybe I say, I want all these small programs to be able to pay their athletes. I know that Indiana State can't pay its players $180,000 each, but maybe I just set it as something a little more reasonable, like $50,000. And yes, some schools won't be able to pay it, but at least it includes a few more. Well, if I'm paying a student athlete $50,000, that number was based on the revenue generated in that sport. If I try to require, I think what was the one that, the bowling teams to pay their players that much, there's no way they have the revenue to do that. Right? So we're going to have to think about how can I discriminate against the type of sport? Well, this is actually, I mean, we could go back, and this is pretty easy to think about if we want to think about the supply and demand for sports. So got a quantity of labor down here. We got, okay, if we allowed the schools to pay their players, what would the equilibrium wages be? Well, I'm just going to assume for a second, and we'll do football. We're going to assume that the supply for football and, I don't know, pick on bowling here, right, would be exactly the same. So even if we held that constant, what we know is going to occur is that the demand curve for football is going to be quite a bit higher than our demand curve for bowling. Right? Why do we know that? Well, if we think about where our demand curve comes from. So it's a little bit harder to look across sports because when we're doing things like, okay, I can take the marginal revenue per win that comes from bowling times the marginal wins that come from labor, right? The quality measure is going to be a little bit different, right? The number of wins that a player adds might be a little bit different, but let's say we could hold that constant, right? What we know is going to occur for sure is that the marginal revenue from each win much higher in football than it is in bowling, right? So even if we held the number of additional wins a player would bring to both these teams constant, we know that football has a much higher marginal revenue per win, right? Just based off some of the numbers that we look at. So I've got this higher demand curve. What that would predict is, you know, wages for football are going to be quite a bit higher than wages for bowling. Right? So we know that we should across different sports, if we're basing payoff the value of those student athletes to their program, there's going to be some sports where the equilibrium wage is quite a bit lower. Right? I probably don't even have this, you know, drawn to scale very well. You know, the difference is probably way larger of a gap there, right? Oh, and that was kind of on the bottom there. I was writing the bowling one out too. So we can really think about we're comparing that marginal revenue between football and bowling. Questions here? You know, I don't think we'll go through these today, but you can imagine, I could think about there could exist supply differences, right? Like maybe to supply that same amount of labor, you know, maybe if it's with bowling, I would require a higher cost. So we could think about there probably are supply differences here. That being said, I mean, you know, well, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but we'll take a look at it because I think it is an interesting thought experiment. Okay. So let's say I've got a labor market. And let's just say I've got my demand curve for labor for football. I think you could, well, now I don't know if I have this drawn enough. Well, we'll ignore this. We shouldn't need this for what I'm going to say. I need this to be able to hit the x-axis, and I didn't have it. Didn't draw it steep enough there. Okay, so I've got it hitting the x-axis down here. If I had more room over here, I could have kept drawing it out. So let's say we've got this demand curve, but what would the supply curve be like? If we ignore quality, like if we go under the assumption that this student athlete could just play on the football team, maybe the good way to think about this is like walk-on players. So we have a lot of universities where a student athlete, they don't enroll initially as a student athlete. They enroll as a student. They then try out for the team once they're there, and then they're kind of given a spot in the team. They call that a walk-on player. Right? That player, right, was given no scholarship. He's not given any of the amenities of the team. So his first hour that he supplied of his labor, he did it at what cost? I mean, zero. I guess technically the opportunity cost, like whatever he would have done with that hour, but clear there was nothing else he valued that high. What if like the supply of labor, right? If it was like based off the love for the sport, there's some people who might, maybe we could get real crazy and actually draw it negative, right? They'd pay to play that sport at that level, right? So if you had the supply curve where it kind of goes against our conventional wisdom that it's not increasing because of the increasing marginal costs, maybe we get kind of wages you could pay. What would the equilibrium be here? Equilibrium wage would be $0. Now, to say they're exactly zero is probably doesn't hold, but maybe it's like a really, really, really flat slope, right? So that you really wouldn't need to pay players that high of wages potentially. And this makes a lot more sense, especially when we're thinking about teams where there's sports where there's not the opportunity to make it to professional level. Because here, there's a huge opportunity cost of playing collegiate football instead of going pro. If I'm just wanting to play collegiate bowling and I can't go professional, or I don't know, choose a sport that doesn't have kind of a very, doesn't have a professional league, potentially get something where there's this really, really flat supply curve. In the most extreme case, if I would just supply my labor, no matter what the cost, then we could end up with a wage of zero. Even this is problematic. This is kind of an extreme view because eventually, if we think about this at the player level, the units of labor is the number of hours. Well, eventually this starts to have negative impacts on the rest of my life. Like, maybe I fail out of the school. So it probably does have some slope to it. It is interesting to think about though, if you truly had someone who would supply their labor just because they love to play the sport, we would end up with, you could pay them this $0 wage. All right. Any questions on that? I know I kind of went a little bit of an aside there. I didn't really plan to do that, but it is an interesting kind of thought experiment. So along this idea of paying different sports a different wage, right? We know that the equilibrium wages should be different. So if I look at my average revenue, it's about $44 million. The average number of players, and this is the athletic department level, right? So the number of players across all sports is about 567. So if we do a similar thing to the, thought experiment to when we were doing it for just basketball and football, I take the amount of revenue, and now I don't even take only 50%. Let's say I use all of it. I end up with each player getting about $40,000, which seems a little more reasonable, even if I do want to set kind of this universal wage. Right? And at the athletic department level, well, they can take some of the revenues from football and kind of share them with the other sports to make sure they have enough money to pay their players. Okay. What about colleges that kind of aren't in the FBS or FCS, so these really, really small D3 programs? Well, if we look at their average revenue, right, there's a couple of them that are surprisingly large. What's the one that's playing right now? The one that Deion Sanders is coaching. Is it Jackson State? Right, they've got some programs like that that are generating some revenue. You'd be surprised at, even though they're really small kind of programs. But even if we take theirs, there's just $3.4 million. It's kind of the average revenue of these small schools across all sports. They still have not as many, but quite a few players. So if we're looking at those non-FBS or FCS schools, like the D3 programs, each student should get about $6,000. Well, a lot of them probably don't have as high of tuitions as maybe kind of, your D1 schools. But I'm guessing a lot of those student athletes, if you told them we'll give you $6,000 a year or we'll give you a full ride, the full ride is probably worth more, right? So when it comes to these small programs, if we allowed them, if we break down their revenue and they're only giving their kind of players $6,000, the scholarship is more attractive, right? If I look at, some of these schools, I don't know, $40,000 is probably a little more attractive than a 1 year of free tuition at a lot of these universities, but maybe some of it's not. Notre Dame, I imagine you'd want the full scholarship. I think they're upwards of like $40,000, $50,000. So, we could start to compare that and think about some of these student athletes, this might not actually benefit. If I start paying them in wages instead of scholarships, it may not actually benefit them. And what's the reason why? Well, what did we say the cost of that scholarship is to some of those schools? Well, if it doesn't displace another student and the student wouldn't have went there otherwise, the cost is really zero, right? So for the school, they don't like this because the wage is higher than the actual cost of the scholarship. And the students wouldn't like it at these small universities as well because they may be getting less money than a full ride scholarship. So it's kind of this unique, like, I hear, you hear people talk about this all the time. And for these really small programs, if you went from a scholarship kind of based program to paying the players, some of them would be worse off. Universities wouldn't like it, and then it wouldn't benefit the universities, and it wouldn't benefit the student athletes. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Yeah. So you're talking about where they were giving players money to use them in things like video games or ads, or so, right? That's completely removed from the schools, though. So the schools aren't giving the players money for that. It's just that the NCAA has stopped limiting the outside opportunities of these players. Now, what programs does that benefit? Your big ones, right? So when the NCAA allows, maybe that's one of the reasons why they previously were preventing a lot of these student athletes from going out and getting side deals, because they knew your University of Alabama football players, your, well, not this year, but your Duke and Kentucky basketball players, right? They're going to have opportunities to make money from outside markets, right? Selling their likeness, maybe doing some ads. That they're going to have a lot more of those opportunities, and so they're going to be able to, it's going to be easier for Kentucky and Duke to get the high quality players, and competitive balance will just get worse, right? Well, that's what they used to think. I guess now that they thought, well, it's just such a violation of kind of our individual rights that we can't really say that we're doing it because of competitive balance. Like we feel like this is an injustice to the player, right? So yeah, competitive balance will get worse because of that, but at least the players are able to kind of go out and earn, take advantage of those outside opportunities and earn some additional wages. Well, not really wages, income, instead of kind of not getting wages from supplying their labor to these teams. It's a good question, though. Yeah, if it was done through the universities, it would be a whole different story. But because it is from outside companies, right? Any other questions or comments there? Okay. All right, so we know that we want to be able to pay different levels of schools, right? D1, D2, D3. We want them to be able to pay a different wage, because we know that a student athlete at the University of Alabama brings in a lot more revenue than a student athlete at DePaul, right? Now, that's like a small school in Indiana, if everyone's not familiar. But I try to use Indiana examples because the most of you we will get them. And we also know that different sports, right, the same quality of player would bring in a higher amount of additional revenue, because the marginal revenue per win is higher in football than it is for bowling. So we want this wage to be able to vary across sport and vary across university. Well, we have a model that really actually already exists, and it exists at within colleges, which is graduate students. So I'll give you my firsthand experience. When I was in grad school, I was given a stipend, which is basically like money to live off for that year. And my stipend was a hell of a lot better than when I was in the business school. It was a lot better than stipends graduate students were getting in like some of the arts or maybe kind of like psychology, because those programs they're not generating as much revenue, right? Whatever you do as a graduate student, it's not going to generate as much revenue in certain departments, right? Usually we want to think about this like business schools versus social sciences, or I kind of picked on the arts a little bit. But when we look at their revenues, they're just lower, right? And so there are different departments are the same as different sports. And I can allow that stipend to vary across departments. I can do the same kind of thing and just allow that stipend or the wage I'm giving to players vary across those sports, right? Depending on that sport's revenue. And you can still, this is the great thing about the graduate school model, if we tried to pay players based off of this, not only does it allow us to vary that wage by the type of sport, we don't have to just give a wage. Usually that stipend when you go to graduate school, if they're giving you some type of stipend, you're also getting a free ride, right? So they're giving you your tuition for free, and then they're saying, here's a little bit of extra money so that we make sure you're eating while you attend while you're in grad school. Not eating a lot, but you're eating some, right? So this model would allow the value of the scholarship to still be there, right? So when we talked about, well, $6,000 a year isn't greater than the scholarship, we don't have to worry about that now. You can give them a scholarship and a certain wage or stipend based off of the revenue that's being generated in that sport, right? So we allow, I kind of mentioned this, we allow it to vary across departments, same idea. We're going to allow this to vary across sports. Right? And, when I went to Purdue, the stipend I got isn't near as much as Harvard graduate students, right? So I can allow this to vary across universities as well. So, and I think people have talked, it's not like I'm coming up with this idea on my own. Like this is something that has been kind of discussed as a potential model, but I just wanted to kind of talk through like the reasonings why this would be a pretty advantageous model based off of what we know about the differences in equilibrium wages that would exist because of across different universities of D1, D2, D3, and across different sports. Okay. Any other questions on that before we keep moving? I think we'll pick up back on this on Tuesday, and I'll go through a little bit more of some of the issues that we would run into if we started to pay players. But I wanted to walk through this paper mainly because I think it's interesting. Actually, I'll just pull it up. I have some snapshots and the slides from it, but also want to start thinking a little bit about linear regression today. Okay. So there's this paper that was written, how long ago now? I want to say it was 2007. I think it actually was published a year or two later, but this was an earlier version of it that I could get my hands on. So basically the question was, is there racial discrimination going on from NBA referees? All right. So the real setup was, I think initially the way they framed this paper is, are there a higher number of fouls called on Black NBA players relative to white NBA players? Right? So was there racial discrimination going on from referees? Like we talked about consumer discrimination, we talked about employee and employer. This is kind of a weird one, which is like within the game, within the performance of the game, not related to wages at all, right? But in the performance of the game, is there discrimination going on from the officiating crew? Okay. So they quickly realized, well, it kind of depends potentially. If we think that there's discrimination going on, it's maybe not like a Black referee isn't going to call more or less fouls on a Black player versus white, or maybe it depends more if the referee is white. So it's almost like the race of the referee and the player would matter. So we start diving into this, and what they realize is, this is how I read papers, by the way. I read like the abstract or the intro, and then I scroll down until I find, here it is, right? Our linear regression equation, okay? So here's our regression equation. What they quickly realize is I can't use the number of fouls because, if I look at the number of minutes a player plays, if they play 48 minutes versus 8 minutes, they're way more likely to get a higher number of fouls called. And if we have any difference in quality, or at least I shouldn't say quality, if we have any difference in the minutes played across races, well then yeah, if one race has a higher number of total minutes played, then for sure they're going to have a higher, well, not for sure, but they're more likely to have a higher number of fouls, right? So instead of using just the number of fouls, we're going to use the foul rate, right? And I believe, let's see if they define this here. Usually it's kind of right afterwards. Let's see where that foul rate variable is. Oh, come on. Per 48 minutes. So it's the number of fouls per 48 minutes is that Y, or that dependent variable. So what we're thinking about there is, our Y variable is essentially kind of this foul rate, or the number of fouls per 48 minutes. Okay? So the real variable that we're going to be interested in here is going to be whether or not kind of that player is Black, right? Or we could do kind of, we could reverse this and do, so I think they break it down into like every race. You could just do, a single race, or you could do minority players or kind of non-white players here. Either, however you want to kind of construct it, this would be what you have in mind. If I see a player that's non-white, right, or if I break it down by race, whatever that racial category is, then this would be a 1, 0 if not. So the way we interpret this coefficient is, if the player was non-white, here would be the expected increase in their foul rate. Okay? What they then said was, okay, but look, we know that maybe the race of the player matters, but, and we'll call this B1, and here we'll call it B2, whether or not the player is non-white, we also think there's an additional effect that might come from, is that referee white, right? So we're going to here have a 1-0 variable for is the referee white, and then a 1-0 variable for was the player white or non-white. Well, this interaction then would tell us, okay, when the referee is white and the player is non-white, if this is positive, that means that white referees, right, are calling fouls at a higher rate on non-white players, right? Because the only way this variable takes on a 1 is if the referee is white and the player is non-white. So that's the basic kind of linear regression setup that they have there, right? So they can identify as they're just general, right? In general, doesn't matter if the referee is white or non-white, are non-white players getting more fouls called on them? And then if the referee is white, are these non-white players even more likely to get fouls called on them, right? Have a higher foul rate. Now they wrote it out a little bit prettier than I did here, so we'll take a look at theirs. So they didn't have every individual call, they only had the calls made at the game level. So you don't just have one referee. So unfortunately, my simple model of kind of using this variable where I look at is the referee white and is the player non-white, I can't make this 1-0. But what I can do is say, okay, what percent of the refs at the time were white, right? And if that percentage is higher, right, if that goes up, is it more likely that a non-white player is getting fouls on them? And they broke this down, so they didn't even do non-white. They just broke this down into white and black players here. Okay, I guess I don't know why they did that, to be completely honest, because there's several other racial groups that we'd be missing here. So I've got a control for the percent of the white referees in the game, whether or not that player is black, and then that indicator that we talked about. Now, the interpretation of the coefficient will be a little bit different because, like I said, it's not just 1-0. It could like range anywhere from 0 to 100%. But we still, if we see this positive, that means when we have a higher percentage of white referees and the player is black, that foul rates would be going up, right? If we see that positive coefficient there. So I'm going to scroll down here. This is how I usually read it. So I look at the regression equation, right? So when you're using your project, whatever regression equation you run, you should like write it out just like they did somewhere in the paper. If I can get back up there, right? And you know, they mentioned not just the variables they're interested in, but all these other control variables. So they had things like player characteristics, stadium effects, whether or not you know game effects here are probably things like the day of the week, the time of the game. They have team effects, so like what the quality of the teams were. They had player effects, which are like picking up player performance measures. So they tried to control for everything possible. So ultimately, once we get to the end here, it'll be like, if I could look at the same quality player, right? The same based off of all these performance measures, they're on the same quality team, their opponents are the same. It's the, you know, the details of the game, you know, time of the day of the week, everything's the same. And they're we have the same kind of percent of white referees in that game, but the player is black instead of white. What's the additional increase in the foul rates there? Okay. So we've got this regression equation. We'll come down to the tables to look at the results. So they did look at the number of fouls here too, but like I said, they realized that's the results there didn't mean much because we have to control for the minutes played. So I think all their tables are at the end. So I think the table I want to show us here first is table 4. Okay. And this is up on Canvas. I didn't expect you guys to read ahead of time, but it's up there if you want to take a look at it. So here's all their control variables, right? And then here's that variable that they interacted, the black, you know, whether the player was black and the percent of white referees. Okay. And our dependent variables foul rate. So notice all of these, and they tried different regressions. They tried including some control, like some of them they included height and weight. Others they had this thing called fixed effects, which is kind of outside the scope of this class, but just know that it's like even more controls, right? We're comparing even more apples to apples. So all of these positive coefficients are saying that when the percent of white referees is higher and the player is black, that the foul rate goes up, right? We're getting more fouls called in them, okay? And notice, I mean, one of them has 2 stars, but all the others have 3. these are statistically significant. The ones with 3 stars at the 99% confidence level or the 1% significance level. Okay? So, I mean, this is alarming. When this paper came out, the NBA was not very happy because this is evidence that there's potentially some discrimination going on in foul calls from white referees towards black players. Okay? Any questions on anything there with the linear regression, the equation, or kind of how I'm thinking about reading this table? Yeah. Yeah, so this is like interesting. So if I remember right, I didn't go over this to find, so I don't think that they did, which seems odd, right? Yeah, so they didn't do that in this paper. And I think that was a criticism. Oh, where am I at? I need table 4 again. There we go. That was kind of a criticism, was that, you know, maybe I have, this is not the correct term for it, but this is what I call it. I always call it like cross-race discrimination. Like maybe it's that white referees are calling fouls more on black players, but potentially also maybe black referees are calling more fouls on white players, right? Now here, the control group is kind of like what we left out is like, if I just look at the indicator on the player being black, because it's negative, that's picking up like what just the effect of being a black player is if white referee percentage was 0. So even if we had 0% white referees, only black referees, we actually see that black players are getting fouls called a little bit less. So maybe there is kind of this idea of like fouls are only being called by referees on players that are different race than they are, right? But they didn't go into that. They specifically were looking here at discrimination from white referees going towards black players. Yeah, no, it isn't. It is. I mean, like I said, it's alarming. The NBA was not happy about this. Now, what would be a better way of doing this? Because maybe I'm just like missing some important control variables here. A really good way of doing this would be like have individual foul calls, right? Because I'm basing this off the percent. I don't know what referees were calling the fouls. Maybe this is like a social kind of peer pressure thing, or you know, maybe if the percent of white referees go up, maybe it's not the white referees making the foul calls. Maybe it's the black referees that are within that group. We don't really know, right? My guess is that it probably is the white referees, but we don't really know because we're doing this at the game level. If we could break this down play by play, well, then we could really get at what this discrimination, where it's really coming from. But this is at least, you know, given our data limitations, especially at the time, there was not a lot of publicly available play-by-play data out there. Now there is some. So that could be something that you see pop up here in the next couple of years. Maybe something that I've gathered a little bit of data on and maybe working with someone on a project with. So, you know, there's a lot more to be done out there. But that was their main finding. I think the other table that I had in the slides was this one right here. So they tried to look and see if like that, not just personal fouls. So that's where we found like and actually, let's zoom in here a little bit. This is kind of small. So this was the table we just looked at, like all the, you know, the different controls. Like we tried a bunch of different settings. So they were all positive and statistically significant. They tried to do the same thing, but they changed their Y or their dependent variable to flagrant fouls, technical fouls. They looked at maybe minutes and whether or not the player fouled out. So the minutes played, the idea was like, if I get more fouls called on me, I'm less likely to be able to play as many minutes in the game. Sure enough, all these are negative and statistically significant. If we look at flagrant fouls, once they kind of get to where they're controlling for a lot, I mean, some of these aren't statistically significant, some of them are. You know, the size of the coefficient is quite a bit smaller, but, you know, we still see some evidence that if the percent of the referees that are white is higher and the player is black, the foul rate for flagrant fouls is also going up just a little bit. Maybe not as statistically significant as just general fouls. It's also positive for technical fouls, but we just don't have any statistical significance there. This is probably more of a limitation of the fact that there aren't as many technical fouls called. So we may have games where we don't have any technical fouls being called, right? So we have a much smaller sample size, which is going to make it harder for us to find these statistically significant effects. And then whether or not they fouled out. So this is somewhat interesting that even though the foul rate of these players is going up, the probability they foul out of the game actually isn't statistically significant at all. It's not changing at all. So it may be something along the lines of, the discrimination is going on. Maybe these referees are making sure when things are, when an extra foul has a huge disincentive, right? If I call, going from a 5th to a 6th foul, if it gets the player out of the game, maybe, they're a little bit more aware and aren't as likely to kind of be discriminatory in those settings. It's hard to say what's going on there with that fouled out variable. I think you could argue it's hard because I can't turn this into a rate, right? Per game, I can't have a foul out rate, right? It's either 0 or 1, right? So it's not as comparable to when we're looking at the number of fouls per 48 minutes. So we have the issue here that if players are playing more or fewer minutes, they're more or less likely to foul out, and we can't really account for that at the game level. It'd be interesting if we could get this down to like the play-by-play level. We could really dive into like whether or not they're more or less likely to foul out as well. Like what you would want to do there is look at all the plays that a player with 5 fouls was a part of, and then use only those observations and then look at the foul rate, right? Because now the next foul called sends that player out of the game. But, I say interesting results. I mean, they're interesting, they're sad, but they're interesting that we can actually pick up on some discrimination that might be occurring within the game, right, coming from officials. Any other questions here? Thoughts, comments? Anything? Yep. So that's the other thing we can't account for here. So like all the thoughts, look, this paper is like, it's well done given their data constraints. But as soon as you start looking at the results, I did exactly what you did, right? Which is why I actually, have pulled the play-by-play data and started to build this data set because, yeah, it does matter potentially on who the foulee and who the fouler and the foulee was. All we have here is who the foul was called on. We don't know if they were fouling a player of the same race or a different race, which would potentially completely enter into this conversation, right? If a referee sees a black player foul another black player versus a white player, maybe that's where it's being generated. We can't say. We just don't know with this data. The play-by-play data is really what we need to really pick up, where this discrimination is occurring at. Yeah, but it does. It gets your brain really, really thinking. All right. I think that's all I wanted to say there. I wanted to mention a few things before we left, so let me put myself back up here before we end. So I have all those third homeworks graded. So if you look at those, I'll get the answer key posted. I'll post it sometime tomorrow. I had it ready to go, and then I realized that I had something missing in it in the scanned version I had. So I'll get that answer key up there. So anytime where I graded it in Canvas, if I left a comment and see answer key, might be a good thing to kind of go back and look at that to make sure that we're understanding the concepts, because I saw a couple things that were pretty far off base. I try to be a little bit more generous in the grading on some errors. So even though I might not have taken a lot of points off, or even in some situation I was a little bit more lenient in what I accepted as a correct answer, I still would probably be a good idea to go back and look at the answer key to see exactly what kind of a complete and correct answer would have been. Okay. I'll also get tomorrow the next homework assignment posted. You will not be able to answer every single question based off of what we've covered in class yet, but I at least want to get it up there so you can start working on the first few problems kind of earlier and not save it all for the last day before it's due. Okay, so I want to give you that opportunity. So I'll get that posted tomorrow. You can kind of start working through that. As we go through material next week, you'll be able to answer probably all of it after Thursday's class next week. Okay. Any questions for me? Anything? Okay. I'll also put up an online quiz after class. Should be pretty easy. Just make sure you go on, submit that prior to Tuesday. It'll be related to what we talked about in class today, just to kind of make sure you at least are making an attempt to look at the material, or if you're not here in person, to watch kind of the YouTube video.
Okay, so that should do it for us. I will see you guys on Tuesday.